Hey guys, so I'm here at the church in Nativity. It actually just closed. You can see the little door is closed and I was able to make it in, so I'm glad I can show you some footage of what it looks like inside right now. And I actually have another vlog, which I will link to in the comments below, that talks more about the history of this church, which is fascinating. So you should watch that if you're interested in the tradition and history of this church. But what I've been sitting here and reflecting on is, surprise, surprise, the story of Jesus's birth in Luke 2. And so I want to read a part of that story today. And so in Luke 2 it says, "In those days Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world." Skip down a few verses. "So Joesph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him, and was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn." Now, if you're like me, you have seen many a Christmas play where there is always an innkeeper and Mary and Joseph show up on the donkey, and the innkeeper has that one famous line where he says there's no room, and they have to go and find the stable out in the middle of nowhere and then give birth to the Son of God out there. And while this makes for a great play, and if you played the innkeeper as a child, I'm not trying to diss that position at all, we are very much interpreting that based off of the English word for inn. Because when you actually read the story in the Greek, the word for there was no room in the inn, what's often translated as inn, is kataluma, or it comes from the root word kataluma, which is better translated as guest room. And actually it's used again later in, I believe, Mark and Luke to refer to the upper room that Jesus and his disciples are going to have the Passover meal in. And we know this especially because in the same Gospel of Luke, Luke chooses to use this word kataluma to describe the inn that there is no room in. But we know that later in the story of the Good Samaritan in Luke 10, a different word is used for the inn that the Samaritan brings the man that was beaten up on the road to. So we know that these are different. There's a different concept that this word conveys, and it's not exactly the inn that we would imagine. And actually, in Kenneth Bailey's book Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes, he talks about how the typical Palestinian home in the first century would have been built out of two main rooms: the guest room at the front of the house, which was reserved for your guests to honor them, and then the back room for the rest of the family and animals, especially if it was winter and you wanted to bring the animals in to keep you warm and them warm. And then you could build you could either have mangers built into the ground, or you could have raised mangers so that the animals could drink or eat out of them. And so with this context in mind, we can see that when there's no room for Mary and Joseph in the inn or in the guest room, this doesn't necessarily mean that Jesus and Mary were out in some stable in like the middle of nowhere, having to do this all on their own. In reality, Mary and Joseph were probably with all of their family members. We can imagine that this was Joseph's extended family, because Joseph was from the town of Bethlehem, and there's a census going on, and so there's no room for them in the guest room. Someone else might have already taken it, or maybe for ritual purity reasons, because Mary is giving birth. She can't be in the main front room. She needs to be in the back. I mean, we don't really know, but we can intuit that there were probably actually a lot of people around, and a lot of people helping Mary as she gives birth to this child. And it sets the context for what I want to talk about next, which is this question that Mary asked the angel when she's told that she's going to give birth to Jesus, which is, how can this be? And the angel's answer, which is, nothing is impossible for God. All right, so back to the Christmas story. when the angel Gabriel came to Mary and told her what was going to happen, she responds with question, because she wants to know how this is going to be. She's not married, she's a virgin, so she wants to know practically, how will this come about? How will she give birth to this baby? And to that, the angel Gabriel answers, nothing is impossible with God. And I spent so much time explaining a little bit of the context regarding like the inn versus the guest room, or the fact that Mary might have given birth to Jesus in this back room surrounded by people, maybe even Joseph's family, rather than in the classic or traditional stable out in the middle of nowhere all by themselves. Not to take away from the humble aspect of the story of Jesus's birth, but because I think that the impossibility, you could say, of the story of Christmas, of the story of Jesus's birth, is found less in the setting of Jesus's birth in Bethlehem, in this back room, and more in the people that God chose, Mary and Joseph, to be the parents of Jesus, and in their own responses to God's call on their life. I think that is really where we see what the angel said, nothing is impossible with God. It's where we see it playing out. So let's start with Mary first, because she is a young 13 to 14, probably, year-old girl who willingly accepts this responsibility to not only bear Jesus, this Messiah figure, as she's been told by the angel Gabriel, but also to accept a very new identity in her society as being someone who is not going to be respected, as being someone who is going to probably be mocked, looked down upon, ridiculed for being pregnant outside of marriage, especially because she's engaged to Jospeh, so that's also unfaithfulness, add that to people's perception of her. And she's the one that the Lord chooses to bear his son. And she responds with curiosity and wonder and maybe a little doubt, but still she says yes. And I think this is especially interesting when we contrast her, with two figures from the Bible, actually. First, just before the story of Mary and Joseph and the birth of Jesus, the Gospel of Luke gives actually a much more detailed account of Elizabeth and Zechariah, who give birth to John the Baptist. And now here is a couple that really fits at least the Old Testament context of these patriarch and matriarch figures in the Bible, because you have a priest, Zechariah, who is well respected. You have his wife, who is older and who has not been able to give birth to a child, which is a common theme throughout Old Testament stories. And then there's this miracle in the temple, and Zechariah is told by the angel Gabriel that his wife, even in her old age, is going to give birth to a son, and they're going to call it John. And there's it's a really beautiful story, and it just makes more sense if you look at the themes and the stories that we find in the Old Testament up to this point. It seems like it could just fit so nicely into how God's story has been laid out so far. And they're married, they're well established, they're respected, and yet it's Mary, a young, unmarried, seemingly insignificant girl, an ordinary person who's chosen to do an extraordinary thing. And he also chose Jospeh. I think Jospeh can be overlooked sometimes because he doesn't really have any direct ties to Jesus, but his character is still so important because in this culture and in this time period, as we know from the story of Luke, Jospeh didn't have to marry Mary. In fact, he could have told the whole town and had her stoned for infidelity, which is not only a kind thing to do, but it's going above and beyond what was already seen as righteous, what was already seen as following the law and removing the sin from their society. He decided to show amazing grace. And yet even to that response, in a dream, God basically tells Jospeh, no, you're going to give even more grace. You're going to marry Mary. You're going to raise Jesus. At that point, when he decides to marry Mary, he had every right to cast that child aside and to start over again, to raise a child that was his own. But he basically adopts Jesus as his own. He accepts Jesus and raises him. And so in Joseph's response, I think we also get a glimpse of the impossible, which is the overwhelming, unconditional acceptance of this baby which is not his own. And so we've talked about Joesph, we've talked about Mary, this very unlikely, ordinary couple being chosen to do an extraordinary thing, and their response of grace and obedience and acceptance of this task. And we've compared it to Elizabeth and Zechariah, which just adds to the impossibility of this couple being chosen. We see again that nothing is impossible with God. He can and often does work through the most unexpected people. And he can work in us and change our heart and strengthen our own ability to respond to such shocking or seemingly shocking calls as he did for Joesph and Mary. I think and know that in our own stories we face things that seem impossible to overcome. Whether it's in our relationships, in our career, in our community or our friend groups, or just in our own trauma, addictions, insecurities, we can feel like we are facing the impossible. How can I ever get out of this situation? How can I overcome my intense fear and anxiety? How can I get over caring so much about what people think of me? How can I break out of an addiction that has ruled my life for so long, year after year after year? How can I get over the loss of a loved one, or rejection, or heartbreak? Sometimes it just seems impossible. And yet to all of those things, we serve a God who is saying, give it to me, for nothing is impossible for me. I can take what is broken and what seems impossible and what seems overwhelming and inescapable, and I can do the impossible. I can work with you, I can heal you, I can love you, and I can free you. And in fact, that is what the birth of Jesus is all about. The light came into the darkness, and the darkness could not be overcome by it. And so my prayer for you this Christmas, and my prayer for myself, is that we will feel that light breaking in. It takes time. It's not always easy, as I know Mary and Joesph experienced, but it was definitely worth it. So anyways, all of this to say, may you have a Merry Christmas, full of God's peace, which is tangible and passes all understanding. And may you see and feel and believe this Christmas that nothing is impossible for God.